Good morning. Great to be with you. Father John Hynes here at St. Catherine of Siena Church near Price's Corner of Wilmington. Today we hear about suffering. Jesus heals a woman, middle-aged, prematurely aged from a constant hemorrhage, and a young girl just at the dawn of womanhood, a girl of 12. He raises her from death. And in our parish this week and next, we have the anointing of the sick. This raises the question of how does a good God allow evil? More exactly, suffering. I think we can say that there's two kinds of suffering. One is, let's say, call it necessary suffering, unavoidable suffering. The pains of labor, when a woman brings a child into the world. The pains and the infirmities and the frustrations of old age as their bodies slowly deteriorate, and their minds. And I think there is unnecessary suffering, the suffering which we have learned to control by modern medicine, the suffering which used to be but is no longer unavoidable. And to withhold healing or comforting for that suffering would be wrong. There is another kind of suffering which I think is in between. It's the suffering which sometimes we can eliminate, sometimes we can't. I think especially of mental illness in various forms. We can help depression sometimes. We can help schizophrenia sometimes. The avoidance of suffering, let's say, which comes from addiction, trying to avoid an unpleasant life, that can be helped by the choice of the person, not by outside help. And so I'd like to dwell for a moment on these unnecessary sufferings which we still permit. That, to me, is the real wrong. It's certainly wrong to use the excuse for preventing mental and emotional suffering because a woman who doesn't want to have a baby would be suffering unduly so she can have an abortion. Or using euthanasia on a person who is no longer wants to live because the pain or the Alzheimer is too great. These are attempts to avoid suffering in a wrong way by doing evil. But what about the in-between cases? The persons who can be helped in their trauma by constant human understanding and help, but no one wants to. That kind of human support which can help a person work their way through suffering. That's something that we as the church can give. And there is another suffering which I suppose we have to say is societal or systemic. Think of racism. Think of all the people in our country, African American, who know that they will never be able to do or to be what white people can be because they began where they are and they've inherited centuries of a deprived existence, which they have not been able to make up in 3 or 4 generations. We can, to a degree, eliminate these sufferings by willing together as a society. Some of it, perhaps, we cannot. The wrong thing would be to not try. I'd like to look for a moment at the woman in today's gospel for a particular reason. The woman who had the constant hemorrhage. She came up hopefully and yet fearfully to touch Jesus. And when she touched him and he said, "Who touched me?" she shrank back in fear. Why? Well, she had violated a taboo. She was unclean because of her hemorrhaging and being a woman. And he was made unclean by her touch, except that he wasn't. Jesus turned around and said to her, "Daughter." There's no one else he calls daughter. He claimed her as his own. In our church, our Catholic Church, women are still unclean. They are unclean in the respect that they cannot hold a position of authority or decision-making in the church, nor can they be ministers of Christ in terms of the sacraments. Is this uncleanness or this suffering a necessary suffering, which is unavoidable, like labor pains or the infirmities of old age? Or is it rather an avoidable suffering which can be healed and made whole? Or is it that something in between, like the racism I mentioned, where it's a combination of a physical aspect of things, but a societal prejudice? We're going to anoint the sick. This is a very beautiful, wonderful, communal, uplifting sacrament. But as we do so, it's good to keep in mind the other forms of suffering, for which there is, in a way, no sacrament, but for which the church must also be responsible to find a way to make people whole. Good to be with you. God bless you. Have a wonderful week. And I hope to see you next Sunday.